The black maid interrupted a heated family argument with one detail that silenced even the Mafia boss himself. Sarah Williams stood by the doorway, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she watched the heated family argument unfold in front of her. The Romano family had gathered in the lavish living room, their voices growing louder and more intense with each passing second. Sarah had been working in the Romano mansion for years, always the quiet observer, always invisible. But today, something felt different. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The loud voices, the accusations, the tension, it all felt suffocating. She stood there for a moment, her gaze shifting between the arguing family members, each one with their own stake in the conflict. At the center of it all, sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, was Vincent Romano, the head of the Mafia family. His sharp, dark eyes glinted with a cold, calculating look, a look that usually made people tremble in fear. But today, his usual air of dominance seemed to have no effect on the chaos surrounding him. As Sarah continued to observe, her mind raced. She'd heard the words being exchanged, the veiled threats, the sharp insults, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. She had never been one to speak up, always knowing her place in the Romano household. But today, something inside her stirred. She had been the one to clean up their messes, to stay out of the way, but no longer. She had a detail, one simple piece of information, that could change everything. With a quiet breath, she stepped forward, catching the attention of everyone in the room. She hadn't planned on interrupting, but the moment felt like it was meant to be. The argument came to a sudden halt as all eyes turned to Sarah. Even Vincent's gaze shifted from the argument to her. For a brief second, everything was still. And then, with an unexpected calm, Sarah spoke. "Excuse me, but there's something you're all overlooking." The room fell silent. Vincent's piercing eyes met hers, his usual cool demeanor slipping slightly as he gave her his full attention. He didn't speak, but his gaze was enough to signal that he was waiting for her to continue. Sarah took another steady breath, feeling the weight of every eye on her. "The real issue here," she continued, "is not what you're arguing about, but who is actually pulling the strings." The words hung in the air, their impact immediate. It was a detail, a small observation that none of them had considered. She saw it in the way the room shifted, how the tension turned from chaos to a stunned quiet. Vincent stared at her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed what she had said. She could feel the intensity of the moment, the silence thickening around them. And then, in an unexpected turn, the Mafia boss nodded slowly, a faint smile curling at the corners of his lips. For the first time that evening, the family members fell silent, no one daring to speak as they processed what Sarah had just revealed. Her simple statement had done what no one else could. It silenced even Vincent Romano himself. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah stood there, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes fixed on her. The heated argument had come to an abrupt halt, and the entire Romano family was now frozen, staring at her in disbelief. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't falter. She had just done something unimaginable, something that no one had dared to do before. Speak up in front of Vincent Romano, the Mafia boss himself. The tension in the room thickened as Sarah's words lingered in the air. Vincent didn't say a word, but his dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach churn. She had never been on the receiving end of such a gaze, yet she held her ground. His silence spoke volumes. Slowly, his lips parted, and he finally spoke, his voice smooth but carrying an undeniable edge. "Explain," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. For a moment, Sarah felt a surge of panic. She hadn't planned to explain herself. She wasn't even sure how she knew what she had said was true. But the certainty in her voice had come from somewhere deep inside her, something instinctive, something that told her the family argument wasn't about what they thought it was. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "What you're all arguing about is a diversion," she began, her voice calm but unwavering. "The real issue lies somewhere else, hidden beneath all the noise." She could feel the eyes of the family members on her, each one now hanging on her every word. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture stiffening as if he was trying to gauge whether she was bluffing. But Sarah wasn't bluffing. She had seen the subtle signs, the hidden details that none of them had noticed. She could read the room. Something wasn't right. It's not just about your business deals or your family drama, Sarah continued, her voice growing more confident with each word. It's about control. Someone has been manipulating all of you, and you've been too blinded by your own egos to see it. She paused for a moment, watching the reactions around the room. The silence was now heavy with anticipation. No one dared speak. Even Vincent remained still, his eyes locked on Sarah, as if he were trying to process the magnitude of what she had just revealed. She could feel the air shift, and for the first time in this room, she sensed something else besides tension, curiosity. You've all been distracted, Sarah went on, fighting amongst yourselves, blaming each other, but the real threat is the one you're not even looking at. Vincent remained silent, but his gaze softened ever so slightly, a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, dancing in his eyes. Sarah knew she had his attention. It was rare for anyone to get this close to Vincent without feeling his wrath, yet here she was, standing in front of him, speaking freely. The power in the room had shifted. There is someone, Sarah said, someone close to you, who has been playing all of you. They've been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't let it show. She could see the family members exchanging uneasy glances, each one wondering who she was talking about. But it was Vincent's reaction that interested her the most. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes never leaving hers. He was thinking, processing, calculating. And then, finally, he spoke. Who? He asked, his voice now softer, almost curious. Sarah hesitated. She had never expected to go this far. She had only intended to make a small observation, but now, standing here, she realized she was in the middle of something much larger. She glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the Romano family. They were all waiting for her to continue, each one eager to hear what she had to say. She looked back at Vincent, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his armor. A crack that suggested, just for a moment, he was willing to listen. It's your brother, Sarah said, her voice low but steady. Luca, he's been setting you up. The room erupted. The family members gasped, exchanging shocked looks. Vincent's face hardened instantly, and for a moment, Sarah thought she might have gone too far. But then Vincent did something she didn't expect. He didn't explode with anger. He didn't lash out. Instead, he simply nodded, his face expressionless, as though the bomb she had just dropped had been something he had already suspected. Luca, he muttered, almost to himself. Sarah could feel the weight of that word in the room. It was a name that carried so much history, so much power, and now, it was out in the open. She had no idea how Vincent would respond, but she knew one thing for sure. Nothing in this room would ever be the same again. The room was heavy with tension as Sarah's words hung in the air, lingering like smoke. No one moved, no one spoke. Vincent Romano, the Mafia boss who controlled the lives of everyone in this room with a single word, stood still, his eyes locked on Sarah. For a moment, she felt the weight of his stare, the intensity of it, and then he finally broke the silence. Luca, Vincent said softly, almost to himself, as if the name carried a deeper meaning. Sarah remained silent, watching him carefully, waiting for the next move. She had no idea how this would unfold, but she could feel the shift in the room, the way the power dynamic had changed. The once chaotic family argument had come to an abrupt halt, and now, all eyes were on her. Vincent, however, seemed lost in thought, his gaze distant. For the first time, Sarah saw the cracks in his armor, the slightest hint of uncertainty, perhaps even doubt. He was processing everything, piecing together the information she had just given him. Sarah could see that the revelation of Luca's betrayal had struck a chord with him, but whether it would lead to action, she wasn't sure. The family members were still processing her words, and Sarah could hear their hushed whispers. A couple of them exchanged looks, their eyes wide, and their expressions filled with disbelief. Sarah knew that this moment would be one they would never forget. Finally, Vincent turned his gaze back to her, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, almost testing her. Sarah met his gaze without hesitation, her voice steady. "I'm sure. I saw the signs, and I'm certain Luca is the one behind this." There was a pause, and then Vincent slowly stood from his chair. The room seemed to hold its breath. Vincent was a man who rarely showed emotion, but his expression now was unreadable. He walked toward the window, his back turned to the others. The silence stretched on, the only sound being the soft rustling of fabric as he adjusted his suit. Sarah felt her heart racing. She couldn't read him, couldn't tell what was going on in his mind. He stood by the window for what felt like an eternity, and then he spoke again. "Luca's always been ambitious," Vincent said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But this is something else." He turned to face them again, his face cold and unreadable. "I'll take care of it," he said with finality. "But first, I need to know more." "Sarah, you said you have proof." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle into her chest. She had no idea what Vincent would do next, but she knew one thing. Things were about to change, and she would need to be ready for whatever came next. "Yes," she said, her voice calm, but inside, her nerves were starting to fray. "I have all the details." Vincent's eyes narrowed, his sharp gaze never leaving hers. "Then I want you to gather everything," he said. "Every piece of evidence. I'm going to need it all." There was a pause before he added, "And I want you to do it quickly. We don't have time to waste." Sarah nodded again, understanding the gravity of the situation. This was no longer just a family squabble. It was something much bigger, something that could change everything. She knew that Vincent was not a man to be crossed, and if Luca had truly betrayed him, the consequences would be severe. "I'll get it," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Vincent studied her for a moment longer before, giving a curt nod. "Good. And don't leave anything out." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air as Sarah turned and left the room. She could feel the eyes of the family on her as she walked out, but she didn't look back. The tension in the mansion was palpable, and Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. She had no idea what the next few days would bring, but one thing was certain. She was about to be caught in a dangerous game, one that she didn't fully understand, but one that she had no choice but to play. As Sarah walked down the hallway, her mind raced. She couldn't help but think about the steps she needed to take next. She had to find the evidence, and she had to do it without drawing attention. She knew that time was running out, and the stakes had never been higher. Luca had betrayed them all, and now, it was up to Sarah to expose the truth before it was too late. The next few hours passed in a blur for Sarah. She couldn't afford to waste time, not now. Every step she took through the grand halls of the Romano mansion felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of her decision was pressing down on her chest. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed out of the way, but today, everything had changed. Today, she was in the center of it all. She reached her small room at the back of the mansion, locking the door behind her. Her heart was still racing from the conversation with Vincent. He had demanded the evidence, and she had to deliver. Sarah moved quickly, her hands shaking as she sifted through the stack of papers on the desk in front of her. These weren't just any papers. They were the details of Luca's dealings, hidden away in plain sight. The connections, the transactions, the people who had been involved. She had kept track of it all over the past few months. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It had to be enough. As she went through the files, Sarah's mind kept replaying the moment Vincent had asked her for the evidence. The calmness in his voice, the intensity in his eyes. It had been like nothing she had ever seen before. Vincent wasn't a man who trusted easily, and now, because of her, he was trusting her with something far bigger than either of them realized. She couldn't afford to let him down. She had to get this right. Sarah paused for a moment, her fingers lingering over the papers. She knew what she had to do. She had to go deeper, find the missing pieces that would confirm Luca's betrayal once and for all. She couldn't just give Vincent part of the story. She needed to give him everything. As she sorted through the papers, Sarah's mind raced. It wasn't just Luca she had to worry about. There were others involved, people who had been pulling strings for years, weaving a web of deceit and manipulation. Luca might have been the key, but he was only a small part of a much larger picture. The Mafia was built on secrets, and Sarah had spent years observing, listening, learning. She had never thought she would be the one to expose those secrets. But here she was, sitting in the heart of the enemy's den, gathering the very evidence that could bring it all down. She continued to sort through the papers, pulling out the most incriminating documents. There were financial records, email exchanges, phone call logs, everything that connected Luca to the people who had been orchestrating the moves behind the scenes. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she looked at the papers in front of her. These weren't just numbers and names. These were lives, people who had been controlled, manipulated, and used for their own gain. And now, it was up to her to expose it all. She couldn't back down now. She had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. The hours slipped away as Sarah worked, her eyes growing tired but her determination never wavering. She knew she had to be careful. If she missed even one detail, if she didn't cover all her tracks, Vincent would never trust her again. And she couldn't afford that. By the time the sun began to set, Sarah had gathered everything she needed. The evidence was clear, undeniable. Luca was involved, but so were others, people closer to Vincent than she had ever imagined. Sarah gathered the files, carefully organizing them into a folder. She had no idea how Vincent would react to the truth, but she knew one thing for sure: it was time to face him. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She was ready. As she walked down the hallway toward Vincent's office, Sarah's mind raced. She had never been this close to him before, never had the chance to speak to him face to face about something this serious. She knew he was dangerous, but she had also seen the way he had listened to her earlier, the way he had trusted her. The weight of what she was about to do settled over her once more, but she didn't stop. This was the moment that would change everything. Sarah reached the door to Vincent's office and knocked lightly. She could hear movement inside, and after a moment, the door opened, revealing the Mafia boss himself. His eyes met hers, and for a split second, she felt a jolt of fear run through her. But she pushed it down, standing tall. "Vincent," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I have what you asked for." The door to Vincent's office swung open, and Sarah stepped inside, the heavy weight of the folder in her hands making her feel as though it contained the entire world. Vincent was standing by his desk, his back to her as he stared out the window, the city lights reflecting off the glass. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. The room was still, the air thick with anticipation. She could feel the tension building inside her, a knot in her stomach, but she knew she had no choice. This was the moment that would define everything. "Vincent," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. He turned slowly, his sharp eyes locking onto hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The way he looked at her made her feel like he was searching for something beyond the files she was holding in her hands. Slowly, he walked toward her, his gaze never leaving her. "You have the evidence." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying intensity in his words. Sarah nodded, the folder feeling heavier with each passing second. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. She handed the folder to him, watching as he took it, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment. Vincent's gaze didn't waver as he opened the folder, scanning through the contents with a practiced eye. Sarah stood still, waiting for him to say something, anything. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last, until finally, Vincent looked up from the papers. His eyes were cold, calculating, but there was something else there too, a flicker of something that Sarah couldn't quite place. "Luca," he muttered under his breath, his expression hardening. "I should have known." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Sarah wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest as he continued to look through the papers. Finally, he set them down on the desk and looked back at her. "You were right," he said quietly. "Luca has been playing both sides." There was no anger in his voice, no outburst, just a quiet acceptance. It was almost as if he had expected this moment, as if everything had been leading up to this revelation. "But what does this mean for us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly, and he took a step closer to her. For a moment, she thought he might say something harsh, something that would make her regret stepping into his world. But instead, he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It means we take action," he said, his voice steady. "Luca's betrayal isn't just about business. It's personal." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. She had helped uncover a secret that could tear apart everything Vincent had built, and now there was no turning back. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, the determination in her eyes matching the strength in her heart. Vincent studied her for a moment, as if weighing his options. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward his desk, pulling out a drawer and retrieving something small, an envelope. He handed it to her without saying anything, and Sarah took it, feeling the weight of it in her hands. "Take this," Vincent said, his voice calm but firm. "Go to the address inside. It's time to close the chapter on Luca." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She took the envelope and turned to leave, but before she could reach the door, Vincent's voice stopped her. "Sarah," he said, his tone softening just slightly. She turned back to face him, unsure of what to expect. "You did good," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I don't trust many people, but I trust you." The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Trust. It was a word that held so much weight in Vincent's world, a world where loyalty meant everything. And for the first time, she realized that she had earned that trust. She nodded, her heart racing in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, before turning and walking out of the room. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Sarah found herself standing in the hallway, her mind racing. She had just been given a mission, a task that would change everything. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain: her life would never be the same again. Sarah stepped out of the mansion and into the cool night air, the envelope in her hand feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her heart raced as she made her way down the quiet street, her thoughts swirling. She had no idea what was in store for her, but one thing was clear: Vincent had placed his trust in her. And for the first time in her life, that trust felt like it mattered. She had spent years in the shadows, never questioning her place in the world, never imagining that she would one day be at the center of something so dangerous, so complicated. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. Sarah's mind kept going back to the folder Vincent had looked through earlier. The way his expression had hardened when he saw Luca's name, how he had reacted to the evidence she had presented. The Mafia world was not one that forgave easily, and Sarah knew that Luca's betrayal could cost him everything. She couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over her. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed out of trouble. But now, she was tangled in a web that went far beyond anything she had ever imagined. The envelope in her hand felt like the key to unlocking a world of secrets, but it also felt like the beginning of something much darker. She could feel the weight of Vincent's expectations, his silent command to get the job done. Sarah couldn't afford to fail. As she walked through the city, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. It was the kind of feeling that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, the sensation that someone knew exactly where she was, what she was doing. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was no one in sight. The streets were empty, the city quiet. Still, the feeling didn't go away. She kept walking, faster now, her steps quickening as the anxiety settled deeper into her chest. The address Vincent had given her was only a few blocks away, but every step felt like a journey through unknown territory. She had no idea who she was going to meet or what she would find when she arrived. All she knew was that she had to stay focused. When she finally reached the address, she stopped in front of an old building, the windows dark and silent. It didn't look like much, just another one of the city's forgotten corners. But there was something about it that made Sarah uneasy. The air around her seemed to shift, the quiet night pressing in on her from all sides. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. With a glance at the envelope, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The lobby was dimly lit, the smell of old wood and dust in the air. The building was eerily quiet, and Sarah's footsteps echoed in the emptiness. She glanced around, unsure of where to go, when a voice broke the silence. "You're here." Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to find a man standing at the far end of the lobby, his features obscured by the shadow. She didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way he stood there, so still and composed, that made her think he was waiting for her. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but filled with curiosity. The man stepped forward, the light catching his face just enough for her to see his cold, calculating eyes. "Vincent sent me," he said simply. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea who this man was or what role he played in all of this, but she knew one thing: she had to follow his lead. "Follow me," he said, motioning for her to come closer. She hesitated for a moment, her instincts telling her to be cautious, but then she nodded and stepped forward. The man led her down a narrow hallway, and as they walked, Sarah's mind raced. What was Vincent really involved in? Who was this man? And why had he been sent to meet her? She had 100 questions, but she kept them to herself, knowing it was better to stay quiet. When they reached a door at the end of the hall, the man stopped and turned to face her. "This is where you'll find what you need," he said, his voice low and firm. Sarah's heart raced as she reached for the door handle. She didn't know what was on the other side, but she knew this moment would change everything. With a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped inside. The room was small, filled with filing cabinets and old boxes. It looked like an office, but the atmosphere was different, more secretive, more dangerous. As she looked around, she realized this was where the real work was done, where the secrets of the Mafia were kept hidden. The man stepped in behind her and closed the door quietly. "You'll find the information you need in the cabinet," he said, pointing to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room. Sarah walked over to it, her pulse quickening as she searched for the file she had been sent for. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew she had to find it, whatever it was, before it was too late. She opened the drawer and began to search, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out file after file, each one filled with information she couldn't fully understand yet. But as she flipped through the pages, one file stood out, Luca's name. It was all there, everything she needed. Her heart raced as she realized just how deep this went, how far Luca's betrayal had reached. She didn't know what Vincent would do with this information, but she knew one thing. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. Sarah stared at the file in her hands, her pulse racing as she carefully scanned the pages in front of her. It was all there, Luca's betrayal, the connections, the transactions, the players. In the shadows who had been pulling the strings. The weight of the truth settled on her shoulders, and for a moment, she felt dizzy with the enormity of it all. She had known Luca was dangerous, but this was worse than anything she had imagined. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they were only raising more questions. She felt the urge to sit down, to process what she had just uncovered, but she couldn't afford to waste any time. Vincent was waiting. Sarah closed the file, tucking it under her arm, and turned toward the door. The man who had led her here was still standing in the corner, his eyes fixed on her, waiting for her next move. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He knew exactly what she had found. Slowly, he walked over to her, his steps silent on the floor. "You have everything?" he asked, his voice calm, betraying no emotion. Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. She didn't trust him, but she had no choice. She had to get out of here with the information, no matter who was watching. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts raging inside her. "Then let's go," the man said, motioning for her to follow him. He led her out of the small room and down the hallway, the atmosphere thick with tension. As they walked, Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't stop thinking about the file she had just uncovered, the evidence of Luca's betrayal and the web of lies that had been spun around Vincent. It wasn't just about business. It was about loyalty, trust, and power. And now, the truth was out in the open. She had no idea what Vincent would do with the information, but she knew it wasn't going to end well for Luca, or for anyone else who had been part of the deception. They reached the front door, and the man stopped to open it, glancing at her one last time. "Be careful," he said in a low voice. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of his words, and for the first time, she realized just how dangerous this situation had become. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her face, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The streets were quieter now, but Sarah felt a sense of urgency that pushed her forward. She had to get back to Vincent, to deliver the information that would change everything. As she walked through the city, her thoughts kept going back to the file. The names, the numbers, the connections, everything was connected, and the implications were far-reaching. She had never imagined that she would be the one to uncover something like this, to be the one to bring down the people who had been controlling everything from the shadows. The weight of the responsibility was almost too much to bear. Sarah quickened her pace, determined to reach Vincent before anyone else did. She knew there were people out there who wouldn't hesitate to stop her from getting to him. She could feel their eyes on her, even though she couldn't see them. The sense of being watched, the feeling of danger lurking just out of sight, grew stronger with every step. It wasn't until she reached the mansion that Sarah allowed herself to slow down. She had made it. She had the evidence. But now, everything was in Vincent's hands. As she approached the door, She hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the handle. She had done everything she could. Now, it was up to him to decide what came next. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Vincent was sitting at his desk when she entered, his back to her as he gazed out the window. He didn't look up as she walked in, but Sarah could feel his presence, the weight of his attention on her. "You're back," he said, his voice low but commanding. Sarah stepped forward, her steps deliberate. She reached the desk and placed the file in front of him. Vincent turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The tension between them was palpable, and Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. "I have everything," she said quietly, her voice steady. Vincent reached for the file, his fingers brushing against hers as he took it. He didn't look at her as he opened it, his attention focused entirely on the documents in front of him. Sarah stood silently, watching him as he scanned the pages. She could see his expression change as he read, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing. It didn't take long for him to finish. He set the file down on the desk and looked up at her, his gaze intense. "You did good," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were contemplating the gravity of what she had just brought him. Sarah didn't know how to respond. His words were not what she had expected. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" Vincent leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "Now we act," he said, his voice firm. "We take this to the people who need to know. We take them down." Vincent's words hung in the air as Sarah stood before him, her heart racing. "Now we act," he had said. The weight of that simple statement settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The truth was out, the betrayal exposed, but the next step was critical. What would they do now? How would Vincent handle this? Sarah knew one thing for sure, there was no turning back. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Vincent leaned forward, his hands steepled together, his eyes locked on hers. "I need you to stay sharp," he said, his tone unwavering. Luca's betrayal isn't just about him. There are others involved, people who think they can pull the strings without consequence. We need to move carefully, but decisively. Sarah nodded, taking in his words. She had known that Luca's actions were just the tip of the iceberg, but hearing Vincent speak about the others, the people pulling the strings behind the scenes, sent a chill through her. She was in deeper than she had ever imagined. But she also knew that Vincent had a plan. He always did. "What's the next step?" Sarah asked, her eyes never leaving his. Vincent stood up, walking toward the window as he gazed out at the city below. "I need you to follow up on a few things," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll handle the people who need to know the truth, but I need you to keep your eyes open. We can't trust anyone right now, not even our own." Sarah's stomach tightened at the mention of trust. She had always believed in loyalty, but this world, the world Vincent was part of, was different. Loyalty was a rare commodity, and even when it seemed like someone was trustworthy, the truth could be far darker. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "Good." Vincent turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "And Sarah?" She met his gaze, waiting for him to continue. "Be careful," he said quietly. "We're playing a dangerous game now. One wrong move, and everything we've worked for could crumble." The words sent a shiver down her spine, but she nodded. She was no stranger to danger. She had lived in the shadows for years, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about taking control, about making sure the truth came to light. "I understand," Sarah replied. Vincent gave her a sharp nod before walking past her, his footsteps echoing through the quiet office. She stood there for a moment, processing everything he had said. The plan was set, and now it was up to her to execute it. With one last glance at Vincent's retreating figure, Sarah turned and left the room. She had a mission now, one that could change everything. The weight of it settled on her as she walked down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps the only noise in the quiet mansion. She didn't know where this would lead, but she was ready. As she stepped into the car outside, she felt the cool night air against her skin, the world outside the mansion seemingly unaware of the storm that was brewing. She couldn't let her guard down. Not now. Not when everything was at stake. The streets were busy, cars honking as they rushed by, but Sarah's mind was focused. She had to follow the trail, find the information that would expose the rest of the players involved, and get it back to Vincent. He was counting on her, and there was no way she would fail him. Sarah's eyes scanned the streets as the car sped through the city, her heart beating fast. Every corner she turned, every alleyway she passed, felt like it could be a trap. She had no idea who she could trust, but she knew one thing. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. The city was alive, full of noise and movement, but inside, she felt the quiet calm of someone preparing for a fight. She had never felt more certain about her purpose. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She wasn't invisible. She had become a key player in this game, and it was time to take control. As the car pulled up to the address Vincent had given her, Sarah's mind went into overdrive. She had no idea what she would find inside, but she had to be ready for anything. The world she had stepped into was one of shadows, deceit, and power. And now, it was up to her to navigate it, to find the truth, and to make sure that when the dust settled, it was Vincent Romano who stood victorious. The stakes had never been higher, and Sarah knew there was no turning back. Sarah stepped out of the car, her heart racing as she faced the building in front of her. It looked ordinary enough, just another nondescript structure on the outskirts of the city. But she knew better. This was no ordinary building. This was a place where secrets were kept, where deals were made behind closed doors. And tonight, it would be the place where she uncovered the truth. The file she had handed to Vincent had set the wheels in motion, but it was up to Sarah now to dig deeper. The plan was clear. Find the missing pieces, expose the full extent of the betrayal, and bring down the people who had been hiding in the shadows. She adjusted her coat and walked toward the entrance, every step deliberate, every movement calculated. The door creaked open as she pushed it, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The building was eerily quiet, and the silence seemed to swallow her every step. She paused for a moment, her senses on high alert. This was dangerous. She knew that better than anyone. But she had no choice. She had come too far, and there was no turning back. As she walked deeper into the building, Sarah's mind kept returning to Vincent's words earlier. We can't trust anyone right now, not even our own. The reality of that statement hit her harder than she expected. She had spent years following orders, doing what she was told, and never questioning the world around her. But now, she was in the middle of a storm, and she wasn't sure who she could rely on anymore. The walls seemed to close in around her as she made her way through the maze of corridors. She couldn't help but feel like she was being watched, like eyes were tracking her every move. But every time she turned a corner or glanced over her shoulder, there was nothing, just shadows. She rounded a corner and found herself at a large door, the kind that screamed of importance. This was it. She didn't hesitate. She reached out and knocked softly, her heart in her throat. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a tall man standing on the other side. He was dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. "You must be Sarah," he said, his voice low but welcoming. "Come in." Sarah stepped inside, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The room was a stark contrast to the hallway, elegant, opulent even. It was clear that whoever worked here had power. The man motioned for her to sit, and she did, her gaze never leaving him. "I've been expecting you," he said, his eyes narrowing as if he were sizing her up. "Vincent trusts you, but you're about to learn that trust is a rare commodity in this world." Sarah remained silent, her thoughts racing. The man was right. Trust was something she had learned to take for granted. But now, as she sat across from him, she realized that the world she had entered was built on deception, betrayal, and shadows. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind in her mind. The man smiled, but it was a cold, calculating smile. "We're not so different, you and I," he said. "Vincent has his reasons for keeping people like you around. But I don't trust you. Not yet. And I'm sure Vincent won't either once he knows what I know." Sarah's mind raced. She had no idea what he was talking about, but she could feel the thread in his words. This man knew something, and he was trying to use it against her. She had to stay calm. She had to stay focused. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I'm saying that I have information," he replied, his voice growing quieter. "Information that could destroy Vincent and everything he's worked for." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had to stop him. She had to get ahead of him before he could use whatever he knew to turn Vincent against her. But before she could respond, the man continued. And if you want to be a part of this, Sarah, you have to prove yourself, he said. Prove that you're more than just Vincent's eyes and ears. Prove that you can make the right choices. Sarah clenched her fists, the tension building inside her. She had never wanted power, never wanted to be more than what she was. But now, it seemed that the choice had been made for her. The man's words hung in the air, his challenge clear. There was no room for hesitation. She had to decide, and she had to decide now. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice unwavering. The man leaned forward, his gaze piercing. You know what to do. You just have to choose the right side. With that, he stood up and walked toward the door, leaving Sarah alone in the room. As she sat there, the weight of his words pressing down on her, she realized that she had reached a crossroads. There was no turning back from this. The game had changed, and Sarah was now a part of it. The question was, which side would she choose? Sarah sat alone in the room, the man's words echoing in her mind like a heavy drumbeat. Prove yourself, he had said. The challenge hung in the air, pressing down on her chest. She had thought she was ready, had thought she understood the stakes. But now, as the silence stretched around her, she realized that she had no idea what she was really up against. The weight of the decision before her felt suffocating. She had never wanted power. She had never asked for any of this. She had only ever wanted to survive, to stay out of the way, to do her job, and keep her head down. But now, Vincent had trusted her with something far greater than she had ever imagined. And the man who had just spoken had made it clear that the world she had stepped into was far more dangerous than she could have ever anticipated. Sarah could feel the walls closing in on her, the room suddenly too small, too suffocating. She had always lived in the background, a mere observer, watching the world unfold from the sidelines. But now, it seemed she was at the center of it all. She had a choice to make, and that choice would define everything. She could follow Vincent's lead, stay loyal to him, to the man who had given her a chance in a world that had never been kind to her. Or she could make a deal with the devil, align herself with the people who had their own plans, their own agendas. The tension in her chest tightened, the decision weighing on her. She stood up, pacing the room, her thoughts racing. What was the right thing to do? What if Vincent wasn't as trustworthy as he seemed? What if the man who had spoken to her, the one who had hinted at power and opportunity, was offering her a way out, a chance to carve out a place for herself in a world that had always kept her in the shadows? She had never been good at trusting people. She had learned early on that the world was full of people who would use you, discard you when you were no longer useful. And yet, she had trusted Vincent. She had believed in his vision, in his plan. But now, as the reality of the situation hit her, she wondered if she had been naive. Prove yourself. The words haunted her, the weight of them pushing her to the edge. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to make a decision, and she had to make it fast. Every choice, every action from here on out would have consequences, and she knew that Vincent was watching, waiting for her to prove that she was worthy of his trust. She glanced at the door, her mind racing. There was no more time to waste. She had to act. With a deep breath, she walked out of the room, determined to find the answers she needed. As she stepped into the hallway, she could feel the tension in the air. The house seemed different now, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She couldn't explain it, but she could sense the shift. It wasn't just the building, it was everything. The stakes had been raised, and now, there was no turning back. Sarah moved quickly, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hall as she made her way to Vincent's office. She had to talk to him. She had to understand what was really going on, what the next step would be. The closer she got to his door, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't just an observer. She was part of something much bigger, and the choices she made now would shape her future. She knocked lightly, then pushed the door open. Vincent was sitting at his desk, his back to her as he looked over some documents. He didn't turn around as she entered, but Sarah could feel his presence, his attention on her. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice calm, almost reassuring. Sarah stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her. This was it. This was where everything would be decided. "Vincent," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety swirling in her chest. "I need to know what comes next." Vincent looked up from his desk, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, he stood up, walking toward her with that same calm presence he always carried. "Next," he said, his voice low, "we take action. We expose the people who have been hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings. We bring them to light, and we make sure they understand the consequences of their actions." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. This wasn't just about Luca anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that could shake the very foundation of the Mafia world. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice steady. Vincent smiled slightly, a rare expression that softened his features. "I need you to stay sharp, Sarah. The game is changing, and the rules are different now." Sarah felt the gravity of his words settle in her chest. There was no going back now. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The next steps would be critical, and as she stood in front of Vincent, she knew that everything she had done, everything she had learned, had led her to this point. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she was no longer just a spectator. She was part of the game now. The hours that followed were a blur of urgency and preparation. Sarah had left Vincent's office, but the weight of his words still hung heavily in her mind. The stakes were higher now than they had ever been before. What had once been a simple task, gathering information and reporting back, had now evolved into something much larger. She was no longer just a part of the background. She was a key player in a game where the rules were shifting by the minute. The air outside the mansion felt different, colder, almost as if the world had grown darker in the time it had taken her to process what Vincent had said. She had been told to stay sharp, and that was exactly what she planned to do. As Sarah moved through the city streets, her thoughts raced. She wasn't sure where the next step would take her, but one thing was certain. She had to stay ahead of those who were trying to control everything from the shadows. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but there were still gaps that she needed to fill. Sarah had no illusions about the world she was in. This was a world where trust was a luxury, loyalty was fleeting, and the consequences of failure were devastating. She had seen it firsthand, had witnessed the cruelty that lay behind the polished facades. But she also knew something else, that she had the chance to change things, to make a difference. The path ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't afraid. As she arrived at the building Vincent had pointed her to, she paused for a moment, looking up at its imposing exterior. It was one of those places that seemed to have no soul, no warmth. The windows were dark, and the entrance had an air of neglect. But Sarah wasn't fooled by the outward appearance. She knew better than to judge a book by its cover. This was where answers would be found. This was where everything would come to a head. She walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the empty street. The sense of urgency inside her grew with every step. She had come too far to turn back now. There was no going back to the way things were before. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, the sound of it creaking behind her. The building was eerily quiet, the air thick with the weight of secrets. As she moved deeper into the interior, her eyes scanned the room, taking in the details. It was a nondescript space, but it felt like a place where deals were made in the shadows, where decisions were whispered that could change the course of everything. She walked toward the back, her heart pounding as she approached the room where she was supposed to meet the contact Vincent had arranged. As she entered, she was met by a man standing by a desk, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He didn't move as she entered, but his eyes tracked her every move. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, a scrutiny that made her skin crawl. "You're late," he said, his voice low and calm, betraying no emotion. Sarah stood still, not allowing herself to be intimidated. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let anyone stand in her way. "I'm here now," she replied, her voice steady. The man nodded, almost as if he expected her answer. "Good. I assume Vincent sent you," he asked, his tone flat. Sarah didn't respond right away. She wasn't sure who this man was, or what role he played in the grand scheme of things, but she knew he was part of the puzzle. "Yes," she said finally. "He did." The man studied her for a moment longer before moving toward a filing cabinet. "You'll find what you're looking for in here," he said, opening one of the drawers and pulling out a thick folder. He placed it on the desk in front of her. "This is everything you need." Sarah didn't hesitate. She reached for the folder, feeling the weight of it in her hands. This was it. This was the key to everything. She opened it slowly, her heart racing as she flipped through the pages. The information inside was overwhelming. Names, dates, transactions, connections. It was all laid out in front of her, clear and undeniable. The pieces were coming together, and Sarah could feel the truth rising to the surface. As she scanned the documents, she realized that the web of deceit was far more intricate than she had ever imagined. There were people she had never heard of before, people who were pulling the strings behind the scenes, orchestrating everything. It was no longer just about Luca. It was about a network of power, a network that stretched far beyond what she had initially thought. She closed the folder, her mind racing. "I have what I need," she said, her voice firm. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. Now, you need to take this back to Vincent. Tell him everything. He needs to know the full extent of what's going on." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "And then?" she asked. The man didn't answer right away. He simply turned, walking toward the door. "Then," he said, his voice cold, "we prepare for the consequences." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. There was no more time to waste. The game was in motion, and it was time to face whatever came next. The drive back to the mansion felt endless, the weight of the folders still pressing down on Sarah's lap. Every word she had read, every name she had seen, played over and over in her mind. The world she had once seen as simple, as manageable, had revealed itself to be something far darker, more complex than she could have ever imagined. The people she had thought she could trust, the world she had assumed was built on honor and loyalty, were all entangled in a web of lies and manipulation. And now, she was at the center of it all. She had no illusions about what would happen next. Vincent was waiting, and whatever he did, whatever decision he made, would shape the future. She had done what he asked, found the information, and brought it back to him. But now she was left wondering if it would be enough, if the pieces would fit together in time. The car finally pulled up to the mansion, its grand exterior looming in the distance. Sarah stepped out, her legs unsteady as she made her way up to the door. She could feel the weight of the folder in her hand, but she also felt the weight of the responsibility she had just taken on. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The mansion was silent as she entered, the echo of her footsteps sounding too loud in the quiet. She walked down the hallway, her mind racing with possibilities. What if she was wrong? What if Vincent didn't trust her after all? What if this was all a mistake? But she couldn't afford to think like that. She had made her choice, and now she had to see it through. As she reached Vincent's office, she hesitated. Her heart pounded in her chest as she knocked softly on the door. When Vincent's voice called out to her, she opened it slowly, stepping inside. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights, his silhouette dark against the soft glow of the night. He didn't turn as she entered, but she could feel his attention on her, even without looking. "You're back," he said simply. Sarah didn't know how to respond. She had come back, but what had she really come back to? The game had changed, and there was no way to predict what would happen next. "I have the information," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. Vincent didn't speak, but his eyes flickered toward her, waiting. She walked forward and placed the folder on the desk between them. Vincent's gaze dropped to the file, his expression unreadable. He didn't touch it immediately, but the tension in the room grew thick, suffocating. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, he reached for the folder, his fingers brushing against hers. Sarah felt a jolt of electricity shoot through her, but she didn't pull back. This moment, this exchange, was too important. Vincent opened the folder and began to scan the contents, his eyes moving quickly across the pages. Sarah watched him, waiting, the anticipation building inside her with each passing second. She could feel the weight of everything she had learned pressing down on her, but she didn't look away from Vincent. He was the key, the person who could change everything. And now, it was in his hands. After a long moment, Vincent closed the folder, his gaze returning to Sarah. His expression had softened, but there was still a quiet intensity in his eyes. "This is more than I expected," he said, his voice low. Sarah didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. "It's all there," she said quietly. "Everything you need." Vincent nodded, but for a moment, he didn't speak. Sarah's heart raced as she waited for his next words. What would he say? What would happen now? "We have to move quickly," he finally said, his voice firm. "This changes everything." Sarah nodded, feeling the gravity of his words settle in. She had already known it, but hearing it from Vincent made it all too real. The game had shifted, and there was no going back. She had done what she had to do, but now it was up to him to lead the charge. Vincent stood up, walking toward the window again, his hands clasped behind his back. You did well, he said without turning around. Better than I expected. The words hit Sarah harder than she thought they would. She had expected anger, criticism, maybe even disappointment. But Vincent's praise was different. It was rare, and she knew it meant something. What now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Vincent turned to face her, his gaze steady. Now we prepare, he said. We take this information and we use it. The people who have been hiding in the shadows won't stay hidden forever. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. You're part of this now, Sarah, he said, his voice softer, but still filled with that same intensity. We move together, or not at all. Sarah felt the weight of his words. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. She had chosen her side, and now she had to see it through. With a steady breath, she nodded. I'm with you, she said, her voice unwavering. Vincent's gaze held hers for a moment longer, and then he nodded. Good. The following days were a blur of activity. Sarah could hardly remember what happened after she left Vincent's office, her mind consumed by the weight of what had just unfolded. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. Vincent's trust in her had placed her at the heart of something far bigger than she could have imagined. Every move she made felt crucial. Every decision, every action, would shape the path ahead. Sarah hadn't expected to be thrust into the chaos of the Mafia world, let alone to become one of its key players. But now, she was part of it, fully immersed in a world that was as dangerous as it was unpredictable. The information she had uncovered, the files she had brought back to Vincent, had changed everything. It wasn't just about Luca anymore. The web of deceit and betrayal reached much further than she had thought. And now, she was in the thick of it. Sarah spent the next few days working alongside Vincent's trusted associates, each task more critical than the last. They were moving fast, preparing for whatever came next. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a feeling that things were about to explode. Every move had to be calculated, every detail scrutinized. The stakes were higher than ever. As she sat at a desk one evening, reviewing documents and making phone calls, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. She knew Vincent was counting on her, and she wasn't about to let him down. But she also couldn't ignore the nagging doubt that lingered in the back of her mind. Who could she trust in all of this? The people working with her? Or were they all just playing their own game? She had learned that trust was a rare commodity in this world. Loyalty was often fleeting, and betrayal was just around the corner. Sarah had seen it time and time again. She knew the game, the way it worked, but now, she was part of it. That made things more complicated. Vincent had been clear. We move together, or not at all. But what did that really mean? What if their goals diverged? What if, in the end, she was just another pawn in a much bigger game? As the days passed, the tension only grew. Sarah felt the weight of it pressing on her every time she entered a room, every time she spoke to someone new. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting for the next move. But there was something else too. Something she couldn't quite place. It was the way Vincent's eyes softened when he looked at her, the subtle shift in his demeanor when they spoke. She had been so focused on the tasks at hand, on the dangerous web she had found herself in, that she hadn't noticed it before. But now, she couldn't ignore it. Something had changed. She had changed. One evening, as Sarah was walking through the mansion, she found herself standing outside Vincent's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear him talking inside. His voice was low, but she could catch snippets of the conversation. She hesitated, her hand resting on the doorframe. Should she knock? Should she interrupt? But before she could make up her mind, Vincent's voice cut through the quiet hallway. Sarah, he called, and it was as if he had sensed her standing there. She straightened, her heart skipping a beat. Come in. Sarah pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. Vincent was sitting at his desk, papers spread out in front of him. But there was something different about him tonight. Something that made Sarah's heart race. I need to talk to you, he said, his tone serious. Sarah nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. What did he want to talk about? She had no idea, but she knew it was important. She walked closer, standing just a few feet away from him. What's going on? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Vincent looked up at her, his eyes intense, but there was something softer in his gaze. I'm not sure what's coming next, he said quietly. But I trust you, Sarah. I need you to be ready for anything. His words hit her harder than she expected. She had always believed in loyalty, in doing what was necessary, but this was different. This wasn't just about following orders anymore. This was about trust, about standing by each other when the world seemed to be crumbling around them. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm, but inside, she felt the weight of his trust pressing down on her. "Whatever happens, I'm with you." Vincent's gaze softened just a fraction. "I know you are." The silence stretched between them for a moment, thick with unspoken words. Sarah could feel the shift between them, the subtle change that had occurred over the past few days. They were no longer just allies. They were something more. But what exactly that meant, Sarah wasn't sure. And that uncertainty gnawed at her, even as she stood in front of him. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that it didn't matter. They were in this together, no matter what came next. And for the first time, Sarah felt like she had a place in this world, a place she had earned, not just by being obedient, but by standing up for what she believed in. As the night wore on, Sarah knew that the next few days would be pivotal. The information she had uncovered, the trust Vincent had placed in her, it all led to this moment. Whatever the future held, Sarah was ready to face it. No matter the cost.